My mother's name, her proper family name, is Balita Honigan. Actually, it's Lani Balita Honigan. They're kind of odd names, especially the Balita part. It's Cuban. She, when she was born, her uncle was there, and her uncle, like a lot of Jamaican men back then, used to go to either Panama or Cuba to work, and he went to Cuba, and apparently he had lots of girlfriends there, and one of his girlfriends was called Balita. So when my mother was born, he came up with the idea of giving her the name Balita. I know this is jumping forward, but she's now known as Valerie. The reason for that is she came to England and was working in Sheffield as a cleaner, and there was an English lady there that said, "What's your name, love?" And she said, "My name is Valita." "What? Valita? Do you mind if I call you Valerie?" And that's how she got the name Valerie. But I think Valita is a beautiful name. So my mother was born in a place called, the parish is called St. Elizabeth, the district is called Black River, and the little hamlet, if you like, is called Blunters district. It literally is a hamlet. There's a few houses there. My family are unusual in Jamaica in that they live on the same land that they were enslaved on. That's quite unusual. But and as I said, my mother's maiden name was Honigan. Now, people who come from St. Elizabeth, if I tell them that my mother's maiden name was Honigan, they know who her father is. Think of Lloyd Honigan, the boxer. You know, this guy owned a local bus, and on his route he had so many women, and he fathered so many children. So sometimes I hear my mother talking about her sisters and half brothers and half sisters, and there's always a discussion: is she a Honigan or a E-Bank? You know, who was she fathered by? And the other thing that people have to appreciate about that kind of life is that there are some almost cliched things, tropes if you like, that people say all the time that have some truth in them. So, you know, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it does. My mother spent most of her time as a kid with her uncle. There was also a Chinese lady in the village who helped raise my mother. When I went back to Jamaica in my 20s or something, I took my mother back with me once, and I had to introduce my mother to her mother. I knew my mother's mother better than my mother knew her. I spent more time with her. This wasn't a bad thing, it's just the way it was in village life. Anybody could give you a clip across the ear if you were naughty. Anybody could tell you off. If you walk past somebody and you didn't say good morning, they say, "Hey, say good morning, young man." You know, it was just the way it was done. So she grew up there, went to school. One of the things she's very proud of is that she had a horse. I think it was that uncle that gave her the horse. So it was, I mean, we're talking now in the Fens of Lincolnshire, right? When my mother comes here and looks at how flat the land is and everything, she says, it's just like backyard. It's just like back in St. Elizabeth. It's flat. It's coastal. It's not exactly reclaimed land, but it's by the sea. And so a lot of my family are fishermen. Sometimes and this has happened a few times, I've gone and met relatives of mine that kind of look like me. They just don't sound like me. and then I connect with them, and then I come back a year later, and I ask where they are, and they say, well, the sea took them. In other words, they went fishing and they're dead. It's just the way it is there. So, yeah, that was life there for my mother.
So the land they lived on, which was in effect the plantation,
Yeah.
what was the plantation growing?
I don't know exactly. One would guess that it's, sugar cane. But when I was there, they grew yam, sweet potato, cashew nuts, dashi, beans, the usual stuff.
We interviewed a guy called Ralph Ottey a couple of weeks ago. Ralph's 99.
Yeah.
He was born in Little London. He lives in Boston still, and he was telling us about being brought up by his grandparents. His father just wasn't around.
Yeah.
Not a problem.
Yeah.
Similar kind of vibe.
Yeah.
The village, it takes a village to bring a child up. And he was saying that there was a significant Chinese community there.
Yes.
So, etc. And there was the church, and the post office, and the school, etc. Very small space.
Well, there was a church in Blunters district in my family were, but literally it was like a church made out of wood. Having said that, it's probably one of the best buildings in the area at the time. There wasn't a post office. If you went to the post office, you would have to get to Black River, the town, not the river, the town. So there wasn't much stuff. Even to this day, if you posted a letter, you still do that kind of thing, they would have to go to Black River to the post office to collect it. But yeah, it was a very kind of... the thing that I remember most of all is I remember giving my grandmother about £60. I think it was around 1986. And she said that this is the most money she ever held in her hand at any time. And I was like, what? My grandmother lived to be over 100, right? How come you've lived so long and you've never held money in your hand? And she's got a house. How did you pay for the house? And she said, well, I do some work for that man over there and he put down the foundation. Yeah, I give that man some planting and he did the brickwork. The other man over there, I give him some sweet potato and he did the roof. And it was just like that. What we would call bartering. But the thing she said to me, which was kind of crucial to understanding what life is like there, was she said that for her, currency was her relationship with her neighbours. That was the most important thing, more important than money. If you left our land and you went to Black River or something like that, Manchester, to get back you would have to cross other people's land. If you're not talking to them, they just stop you. So relationships with your neighbours is really, really important.
Totally agree. I mean, that whole thing around sort of values and relationships was this sort of transactional relationships. Yeah. Now, your father, Barbados.
Yeah.
No,
I don't really know much about my dad.
Yeah.
I don't really know that much about my father's past. I can hardly tell you anything about it. I'll tell you something. I'm a twin. When I was born, I was a very difficult birth. I was born in a place called Marston Green, which is like really posh Birmingham. That's not where we lived, but that's where my mum worked. So she arranged it that I was born in the hospital that she worked in. So they were taking her to the maternity room where she has the baby. And I was so difficult, they had to say, stop in the corridor, we've got to do it here. She's got to give birth here. my father was walking up and down, really agitated, really loud, really emotional. And I'd heard about this story for years. So when it came to me writing my autobiography, I wanted to find out from my mum, was it really true? Was he really that emotional? And she said, absolutely, yes. Because I'd never seen him be emotional. I'd seen him be angry, but I'd never really seen him show any other emotion. And she explained to me that he thought that I was going to die. When he was born, he had a twin that died at birth. When his dad was born, his dad had a twin that died at birth. So my father was convinced that it was just another one. I'm convinced that if I was born in the developing world, I probably wouldn't be making it. You know, you'd be sitting here talking to Eddie Grant now or somebody like that. But yeah, you know. So I don't really know that much about him. Later on in life, he became very violent towards my mother. I sided with my mother. Me and my mother left. He didn't like the idea that I wanted to be a writer. I remember once he caught me with a book and he slapped the book out of my hand and said, "Why are you reading a book? You got nothing to do." He thought you read a book if you had nothing else to do. I remember when I wrote my first book and I had like a pretty girlfriend and I went to see him to give him a copy of my first book. He didn't even look. He looked at the front cover, threw it down and went, "Who wants to hear what you've got to say?" In front of my girlfriend as well. Many years later, I decided, because what happened was he was living in England. I hardly know him. He was living in England and the doctor said, "You've got 6 months to live," for some reason. He had gout and some other problems. He literally just emptied his bank account and everything and went back to Barbados and lived for many years. And at one point I went, right, I'm going to go to Barbados to kind of make peace with him, to see him. And I went, and it was a little bit odd. It was like he was doing all the things that he didn't or couldn't do while he was here. You know, he had a sports car. He used to bid the horn. It used to go do 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 do. Ford Escort it was. And and he'd get up in the morning and he'd go to one beach. He got a girlfriend there. And he'd go to another beach. Got a girlfriend there. And I remember he said something to me once that really made me feel uncomfortable. There was a girl walking down the road and he said, "You like her? You know, would you do it?" I was like, what? I mean, when he was in England, he was really conservative, you know. And I had to really shout at him and tell him, you know, not to think of him like that, etc. And I had to give him a lecture. Anyway, I kind of made peace with him, I think. Not long after that, he was driving these little buggies around, not because he needed the money, but just for the fun of it. Tourist, you know, it's like a little beach buggy thing, and you drive them around. And he was driving a couple around, and one of them was reading one of my books. And he said, "What you read there is an English book." And he said, "This is a woman's." He said, "This book is by a guy called Benjamin Zephaniah. That's my son." And obviously I wasn't there, I just heard about it. She then gave him a lecture on Benjamin Zephaniah, and he had to say, "I didn't know all this." So he didn't really know me, as much as I didn't really know him. I probably knew him more than he knew me in a way.
Yeah.
But that was it. When I came back and I said to the doctor, I said to the doctor that I see my father, my doctor was like, "What? He has to be dead." I said, "No." And, you know, he started pulling all his files out and ringing his friends and saying, you know, "We had these readings and that reading. He can't be alive now." And I said, "Yeah." And they were saying, "We will pay for him to come back so we can run some tests." And the dad was like, "No way." He thought that if he came back, the clock would start ticking again. You know. And he just put it down to, again, another one of those cliches, but he put it down to fresh food, you know, clean air and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's interesting there. I mean, gosh, we could go there, but we ain't going to go there. I mean, we've interviewed quite a few people who've decided to leave their country of birth and travel, to the UK, whether it's Lithuanians, Jamaicans, Indians, I mean, how, why, and when did your mother decide to come to England?
Well, it was around 56. Her and her sister, or she and her sister, were walking down the street, and they saw one of the posters that was put up, ironically, by a campaign run by Enoch Powell. It said, "Come to England, the streets are paved with gold, there are opportunities here." Then it had a list of the companies that were looking for work: British Rail, the GPO, the NHS, all that. And my mum always wanted to be a nurse. When she was small, she dressed up as a little nurse. And she didn't dress up as a Jamaican nurse, she dressed up as an NHS nurse. She wanted to be in the NHS. So she said to her sister, "You want to go to England?" And her sister said, "No, it's too damn cold." And her sister stayed. And that's the difference between me and my cousins, I always think that's the difference that day. It could have been the opposite way around. It could be that she went and my mum would have stayed. Who knows? But anyway, so my mother didn't have enough money, so that uncle gave her the money. I believe it was £70 to pay for the ship, the hotel in Kingston, to get to the docks and all that kind of stuff. And she came over on a ship. To this day, we don't know the ship. And I have friends in the Windrush Foundation who research every ship. My mother insists that it was a ship called the SS Piano. I'm not sure if she's pronouncing it wrong. I've got people to research it and we cannot find it. I mean, I always joke with her, and nowadays it's a dangerous joke to say that, "Are you an illegal immigrant, Mum?" But she went over on the ship. She stopped, I think, in Greece on the way, and then came to Southampton, got on a train and went to Sheffield.
Why Sheffield?
We had another relative there who could get her a job cleaning. And when they first come, when she first come, any job would do. So she started cleaning. This is where she was cleaning with a woman that decided to call her Valerie. And then one day she met another woman who said, in Birmingham, there's a recruitment drive on for nurses. Go there, do a bit of training, you can start working as a nurse. So she packed up. She went to Birmingham. And that's where she met my dad. And that's where she trained as a nurse and worked. It used to be called, back then, state registered nurse. So she became a state registered nurse. And she's one of those Windrush generation women that are like really proud of the fact that she worked for the NHS and kind of helped to build the country and all that kind of stuff. I mean, sometimes for me she goes a little bit over the top with it, but it's what gave her pride at the time. Like I said, when she was in Jamaica, she always dreamt of working for the NHS. So to come to England and it's her second job, and then she stayed with that job most of her life. Even when she retires, she goes back and works in the NHS as a volunteer. Now, unfortunately, she's very ill, and it's interesting because when nurses come to help her and everything, she can lecture them a little bit and stuff. But what I find a little bit depressing is the talk about foreigners in this country taking up stuff and using up the NHS, and we know that people like my mum built the NHS, and like a lot of immigrants are more likely to help build the NHS than use it. And obviously most people use it when they get to the end of their life. But you know, she had 8 kids, and apart from when she was getting older, hardly used the NHS. She's always kind of almost boasting that me's a strong woman. I give birth to 8 strong kids, and she knows all of it. Even though she's ill now, her mind is still sharp. She knows all about birthdays and all that stuff. So yeah, that's how she came, why she came, and where she came to.
Roughly how old was she then? I think. Ish.
Gosh, I think she was like.
How old was she when she had you? You were born in 58.
I don't know. You got a passport, man.
No. All right, no, that's okay. You don't have to. No, just trying to get that sort of her journey. Really. That's fine. That's okay. So when she left, what, I mean, can you imagine, or did she ever tell you the stories, little conversations you would have with her uncle or of siblings, you know, about I'll go and you follow, or you know, I promise to write, or you know, I mean.
Oh, there was all of that. You know, it's always, you know, stay in touch by writing. And remember then, you know, writing was a long thing, as they say nowadays. You had to write a letter, go to a post box, wait for it to go. When it arrived, somebody else had to write a reply back, post it back. And they're not in the city, so it's not like it arrives and the next day it arrives in Black River, right? Somebody sends a message to the village that there's post for you, or they just happen to be in town and then they go and check in the post office. So it could be months. But the other thing they did a lot of, and you have the photographs for this too, is standing next to a piece of furniture or something to say, I've arrived, you know. Open the record player, or the gram as it was called, and pose next to it, say, look what we've got. In their best dress, you know. So there was a lot of that. And sometimes there was feedback given back home to encourage people to come. We have a very sad story in our family of my Aunt Ruby, who was encouraged to come after my mum. I can remember her arriving, the excitement, auntie coming from Jamaica. She came, she lived in a bedsit, she met a guy, they had a couple of kids. And in those days in the bedsit you used to have paraffin heaters. And it turned over and killed the children, burnt them. And I was small at the time, and I didn't understand it. I remember going to the house afterwards. The house was burnt out. And opening a cupboard, and there was a box of cornflakes. And I said, Mum, can I have the cornflakes? And she was like, no, you know, you've lost, your cousins have died. And I just got angry because I couldn't have the cornflakes. I said, but they don't want cornflakes, and they'll be back. I remember saying they'll be back. Because I was watching television, and I would see actors, you know, like John Wayne or whatever, and you see them get shot, and then they're back in another program next week. So I thought when people die, they come back, you know. And my mum had to explain to me, this is not like television, they're gone forever, you know. So, but there were lots of stories like that. That was our story, but I remember other stories in the family where, or in, not just the family, the wider community, of a fire, or somebody had a gas heater that's leaked, killed them in the night. I remember hearing stories about people being beat up by what our parent generation would call teddy boys, I mean, racist men basically. And the other thing, there wasn't no talk about racism, but I remember the colour bar. So there was this shop you can go in, but you can't go in this one. You can go down there, but you can't go there. Why, Mum? They have a colour bar. What does that mean? Well, they don't like coloured people, so you don't go there. And it's really funny. It was just like it was like having I don't know, a gift card or something, and you can use it in this shop, but you can't use it in that shop. You can use it in this shop, but you can't use it in that shop. And the way that my parents told me was like, it's not a bad thing, it's just the way it is. This is the reality. There are some places you can go, there's some places you can't go. When I suffered my first racist attack, I was about 8 years old, walking on a place called Farm Street, where we used to live. And a guy came behind me on a bicycle, and he had a brick in his hand. And he slapped the back of my head with a brick. I can feel the scar to this day. And he said something like, "Piss off home, you black." No, I beg your pardon. "Piss off home, you black bastard." And I remember going home and telling my mother what he said. And my mother said I shouldn't use the word bastard, it was a bad word. And I said, "But that's what he called me, Mum." And she said, "Don't say it." I said, "But he called me a bastard. What's a bastard?" My mum said, "Bad word, bad word." And then I said, "Mum, why did he tell me to go home? I was going home." To me, I was going home, right? Then my mother had to explain that when he means home, he means something different to what I was thinking. Because as a kid, I was just like really puzzled by it, trying to work it out. You don't really think. No, you're not really thinking of nations and borders and passports and this country belongs to this person or something like that.
She arrives in England, hostile environment, colour bar, everything. Yet the letters they write back.
Yes.
With those lovely photographs of them.
Yes.
That's
because they don't want to admit that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was similar.
Yeah. They don't want to say that it's not going as good as they thought it would be going. There's lots of stories about, and I asked my mother about this, and she said it's absolutely true, about people who arrive, and one of the things they do, they look up at the sun, and they go, "Wow, these people are clever. The sun is shining, but it's still cold. How did they do that?" It's like really strange. And the other thing is, when they look at the houses and they see all the chimneys. Because in Jamaica, when you see a chimney, it's a factory, and they go, "Wow, look at all these factories." And somebody has to explain to them that those are houses that people live in. One of the things that happened to my mother that she doesn't really like to talk about is there was a train crash somewhere in the Midlands. And in those days, it wasn't sophisticated like it is now in command centres and all that stuff. It was get some people from the hospital and go there and just rescue as many people as we can. Back up the fire brigade, and they cut people out. They'd hand them over to the nurses and the doctors. So my mother rescued somebody, and this man was in her care, went with him in the ambulance to hospital, and she was taking care of him, and he woke up because he was knocked out, and he woke up, and when he saw a black woman above him, he slapped her face. And Mum said, he was confused. But he wasn't. When he slapped her face, he said some racist thing like, "Move this black woman from me." So he wasn't so confused that he didn't know. He knew what to say, basically. And this thing about kind of writing home as well. As recently as kind of in the early 2000s, I made a program about people living on canals. Why are there no black people that live in narrow boats and live underwater? And I found one guy that did, a young Rasta, dreadlocks guy. And the only reason why he did it, he said he was full of debt. And he worked out that if he sold his house and did everything and bought a narrow boat, he'd be free of debt, and his lifestyle would change. Apart from that, he found nobody actually from the black or Asian community. And one of the reasons, I think, the most prominent reason that people gave, sometimes they gave it directly or indirectly, it was like, how can you write home to Bangladesh or Jamaica and say, "Yeah, everything nice, I live underwater"? They would think that is going backwards because, they think associate living underwater with poverty. So you couldn't write home and say that. You have to write home and say, yeah, I have a house, and I have a car, and I have a gram, and I have a table, and I have a nice dress. You don't want to say that you're a nomad on the waters.
I mean, those letters, they're amazing. I mean, another gentleman we interviewed, actually interviewed his daughter. He kept all his letters that he wrote back. He copied them all, etc. Those letters going back, but slow over the years, they just became more truthful.
Yeah.
Slowly, and it's fascinating. Like dawns. In the beginning, it was all milk and honey.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely, the reveal. Really. I'm curious. Tell us a little bit about your mother. Does she have a sense of humour? Did she have time to go to the pictures or read? When back in either home or here. Her first job you said was cleaning. Give us a little bit of a picture of the letter and the family.
It's funny because you should mention the pictures. It's funny that you should mention the pictures because for a while, I remember there was a short time when she had a job at a cinema, and it was great because we could go and, especially Saturday morning matinee, we'd go and watch films free. And films then were, we watched cartoons and Flash Gordon and John Wayne. So yeah, that was a job. I don't know why she had that job. It was just like a job in between jobs, because it was kind of in between her nursing. I can't remember. It was probably part time. Some of these women and men had two jobs. So she wasn't really a cinema goer, but she worked at the cinema. And when she worked there, I do also remember some nights where she would say, it's kind of a bit more of an adult film, but I would go with her. Again, the ones I remember most of all for some reason are John Wayne. He just seemed to be everywhere at the time. Or if not John Wayne, cowboy films. She was a very... she was always cracking jokes. She's very religious. She can't understand why other people are not Christian. She was having a talk with a friend of mine not so long ago. She'd known him for a while. And then she said something like, when you go to church on Sunday, pray for me or something. And he said, I don't go to church. And he said, but she said, you are a Christian, you don't believe in God. And he went, no. She went, what? And she literally called me and went, did you know that Tony doesn't believe in God? Yeah. And I got a brother who's a Muslim. I mean, our family's full of all kinds of religions. And my mum just doesn't get it, She just thinks Jesus is the saviour. And she thinks Jesus is white. I've tried to show her that, it's impossible that he could be white. But she's got the very kind of colonial take on Christianity. She has got Christianity as according to the moral values of Henry VIII. It's really strange. When she was younger, I remember I had a friend who was obviously gay, and this guy couldn't talk to his parents, he couldn't talk to anybody, he didn't even really talk to us about it, but he talked to my mum about it. She was very open-minded. There came a time in my life when I was always getting in trouble with the police and stuff like that, so my mum had to go to the police station and bail me out, but she bailed some of my friends out as well. There was a time when, if you could imagine, like in Birmingham there was various gangs, and my gang was like a kind of cross between, well, I used to call us like Rastafari and Peaky Blinders. We kind of believed in God, but you don't mess with us, because God can be vengeful. And my mum was like almost like the godmother. I mean, she didn't get involved in crying, but she was the one place everybody could go for food, you know, and they could go and talk to her, and they called her mum. So she was very open-minded back then, and I remember I was doing a program for Channel 4, and we had to go and film my mum in Birmingham, and we did what we had to do. The thing I remember about it, like, we arrived and she was just dressed normally, but when she saw the cameras and everything, she went and got dressed like she was going to church. And she would just talk to us in a normal way, you know. She talked like this, talked like that. And then when the cameras were rolling, she tried to speak the Queen's English. So the camera people had to trick her. So then she thought the camera was off, it was on. You know. The red light means it's off, Mum. You know. And then she was relaxing, just be more open. And then we'd have to tell her, you know, we just had to trick her.
It's a thing.
But and in that film she talks about a lot of the things I've talked about today. But the thing is, months later, I was talking to her, and she said, "Oh," his name is Brendan, said hello. Who's Brendan? Oh, Brendan was the sound man in the film. They stayed in touch. You know, I have another friend, a martial art friend, who met my mum once. They've stayed in touch via letter. So she was always making. I had a friend who was a young girl, and at the time, I mean, I wouldn't normally say this because it's not really an issue, but at the time, it was a different time. She was a young black lesbian, and I asked my mum, do you know anybody, because he's from London, and she wanted to move to Birmingham. Mum, do you know anybody that can rent her a space? Oh, she can come and live with me. You know? And then one day my mum called me, she goes, do you know, she's a lesbian? You know, I said, I know, Mum, you know, but don't worry, you'll be all right. So she was very, very open-minded. As she got older, she lost a bit of that. And now, like I said, she's not very well, and she doesn't like meeting new people. She can still be quite funny. She sits there, she lies there in a bed, she can't get out of bed, and she watches. She's got the window where she watches people going past, and she waves to them. She doesn't want to see them, she just gets somebody to close the curtain, and she's got a television there, and she can tell you every plot line in every soap. Yeah. She can tell you exactly what's going on in Coronation Street, exactly what's going on in EastEnders, exactly what's going on in Emmerdale, and all the game shows as well, The Chase, Pointless.
I mean, so it must be quite amazing. It must be amazing. There she is. You know, she's having these children. It's the late 50s, 60s,
yeah.
etc. What sort of community is there in Birmingham at that time?
Oh, we lived in a place called Aston, and what we called multiculturalism then was the Irish community, Greek Cypriots, and the black community. I remember seeing the Asian community just starting to come, and the gypsies, or the travellers. They were probably my favourite people, because they were all into poetry and sitting around a fire and telling stories and stuff like that, playing guitar. There's something I have to say about my mother. She didn't read books, but she had lots of poetry, oral poetry from Jamaica. You know, she would recite and sing things, kind of Jamaican versions of, you know, Ringa Ringa Roses and stuff like that, poems. In Jamaica, poems and songs are very closely interlinked. You know, in a lot of cultures they are actually. You know, songs are just sung poems. So she was full of that, and I think that's where I got a lot of my poetry from. But I love sitting around the campfire with the gypsies and the travellers, because they recited poetry to each other. They had games where somebody would say a line of poetry and then the next person had to make something up. And, I loved doing all that stuff. So that was multiculturalism back then.
And I mean that kind of support then. I mean, so like your neighbours, were your neighbours white or black, and did it matter? And if your grandmother, or if your mother or your brother or your neighbour was poorly, would people step up and have your back? I mean, how did that work?
Well, it's funny. I don't really remember any racial tensions or anything like that amongst the people. And I remember we were all poor, so we didn't really see rich people.
Sure.
We didn't appreciate how poor we were. But on the whole, people were supportive. I do remember once going home with a boy, because he had a certain lot of toys that we didn't have. And I was going home with him. I always used to go home with him and play with his trucks and whatever. And then we got him close to his house and his sister came. And his sister said, "You can't bring him home." And I was like, "Why not?" And she was like, "Dad's at home." I was like, "Oh, your dad sounds so good. Your dad buys all these toys. I want to meet him." And she was like, "No, Dad thinks that all black people should be slaves." I was like, "What's a slave?" I had to go home to ask my mother what a slave was. And then my mother kind of explained to me what slavery was. And then she said, "But it's all right, son. Our people sinned against God. That's why we suffer the persecution and the tribulation. But when you die, you go to heaven. And that's cool." And I was like, "Yeah, I want some of that stuff now, So again, she's kind of making excuses or finding a way around it that doesn't really punish the perpetrator. I remember I'm sure I write about this in my autobiography, but I do know that I put it in one of my novels as a scene, but it comes from what happened to me. Me and my mother were waiting in a queue in a shop to be served. And a woman came in and shouted to the other woman, "You're not going to serve this before you serve me, are you, Ethel?" And Ethel said, "No, Mildred, it's all right. Come." And I was, "Mom, it's not fair. We're waiting in the queue." And Mum was, "Oh, it's okay. She's in a hurry, That was back then. Quite recently, I said to my mum, she was complaining about somebody, and I said to my mum, "Mum, I've never heard you complain about white people." And she went, "I never would." She said, "I'd never complain about white people. We are guests in their country. They can do what they want. We are guests." And I just said, "Mum, I don't feel I'm a guest in the country,